Hey guys! Alright, so I asked Reddit for some advice or clarification, like questions for advice or clarification about different typological concepts. And I got some, I'm like honestly surprised I got some really great questions. So I can't wait to get into these. Let me adjust you. Okay, so the first two questions I'm going to answer, I'm only going to do one in this video, are from the user perfectchaz321 with a bunch of Z's. So hi, and their first question is they want an in-depth list of practical ways to develop functions and when to focus on developing which function. So as far as the practical ways to develop functions and like in-depthness, I'm gonna save a lot of that for future articles. It's a really good idea, but I just feel like there's too much and I can't like fit it all into one video. But I will do like just some brief examples of each function. And what I'm really interested in is talking about when to focus on developing particular functions and also like what it means, like how to develop a function, what that means. So an important thing to remember is that there's a pretty consistent pattern of development that most like healthy functional human beings share. And I need to do more research on it to make sure I have like all the exact, you know, information down. Like this, what I'm about to tell you is just basically my current understanding, and I think I need to flesh it out a little more before I like write an in-depth article about it or something. But so basically when you're young, I do believe you have a type either from birth or like very shortly thereafterwards, because you can see even in babies, you can see whether they're introverted or extroverted, things like that, thinking or feeling, I think too. But when you're like a preteen and younger, your functions are pretty well balanced. Like you still have a dominant function. Like when I was a little girl, I was still obviously an FE little girl, like listened to adults and did what I was supposed to and smiled and, you know, but you feel like ideally, you know, assuming there's not any issues or whatever in development or your family or whatever, you feel pretty safe and comfortable. And when you feel safe and comfortable is when you express your inferior function the most. So when you look at a little kid before they hit the teenage years, they're pretty openly using their inferior function. They're still gonna like primarily express their dominant and auxiliary functions and demonstrative and all that, like their strong functions, but they are not going to be generally hesitant or uncomfortable with using their inferior function. So during childhood, children should basically be exposed to everything, the opportunity to develop any kind of function, and especially I think it would be good to focus on their dominant function because like they don't have that much information or experience with even that yet. So the more you can give them dominant and I guess inferior when they don't have any walls up or any barriers, then like the more that will help them later on when they're developing other functions, you know, because they've already got that kind of down pat. Yeah, I would avoid challenging a young kid too much with their vulnerable function, their role function, just because they're not even that good at their dominant functions yet, you know, compared to an adult, so you don't want to like overwhelm them. Once you get into your teenage years, something interesting happens, which is that you start to develop your ignoring function. So in case you don't know, your ignoring function is the opposite function attitude of your dominant function. So for example, I'm ENFJ, my dominant function is FE. So my ignoring function is the opposite function attitude, it's FI. Okay, if you're an INTJ, your dominant function is an I, your ignoring function is NE, and so on. So yeah, in your teenage years, you start to focus on integrating your ignoring function, which kind of has the effect of making your dominant function like complete, you know, like FE and FI work together. There's not like two separate functions that like don't communicate with each other. They have, it's more like a spectrum of viewing. I don't know if spectrum is the right word, but anyway, they interplay with each other, right? Like you can't understand objective values without understanding the influence of the subjective, and vice versa. You can't have strong, if you're an FI Dom, you can't have like actually good morals if you don't understand the needs of the people around your society, right? So it's important to have both perspectives, especially if that's like the primary lens through which you view the world. So in your teenage years, you begin integrating your ignoring function more, which often leads to the suppression or even the rejection of the inferior function, because they're two opposite like functions, like TI and FI or NI and SI are opposite. You can't NI at the same time as you SI. You can't TE at the same time as you FE or whatever. So when you're in high school, about that age, I would say like earliest 13, 14, all the way through early 20s, about that age range, I think is a very good time to focus on developing and working on your ignoring function. And I would also very strongly recommend that people during this time like avoid making harsh negative judgments about their inferior function. It's okay to not want to use it or to not feel comfortable with it, but it's too easy to, you know, for example, an ITP, an INTP or ISTP with dominant TI ignoring TE, to completely reject FE and say feelings are bullshit, like who cares, like nothing matters anyway except what the facts are. Like, it's one thing to like learn how to interpret and understand TE, but you don't have to like reject FE in order to do it, and no matter what your inferior function is. So I would say focus on integrating your ignoring function, practice that. We'll talk about how you can, because it's not super straightforward, but don't reject your inferior, and I would say don't turn down opportunities to learn with it, because it's not, you know, it's not something you actually have conscious control over. So the only way that you could avoid developing your inferior function is if you just like consciously rejected it. If someone came to you with like, you know, someone came to me with a TI thing and I was like, no, I will not hear it, then like that could be a missed opportunity. So okay, so from your mid-20s or so into I'm not sure the exact age range, I would say about 35, so let's say earliest 20 years old or so, latest about 35, you should be pretty much finished integrating your ignoring function, and this is when you're going to start seeing your inferior function developing. So this is probably one of the biggest changes that people make consciously, or they don't make the change consciously, but they're conscious of the change happening. So a lot of people say, you know, when people say like, oh, I used to be this type, but now I'm this type, like what they're really seeing is that natural progression from focus on ignoring function to focus on inferior function. So during this time, definitely seek out as many opportunities as possible to develop your inferior function. It's really important for the development of a human being to have a well-developed inferior function for your, you know, for your type. Like, you're never gonna have the same kind of, you know, if this person's an ENTJ, perfect Chaz, you're never gonna have the same FI as an FI Dom. Like, it's just not possible. It doesn't mean it's worse or better, it's just different. And so, but it is really important to develop your FI as much as you can during that age range, because your inferior function represents kind of like your core identity, or your like lifeblood, like your long-term goal for satisfaction and fulfillment. And I think it's really important for leading a healthy life into the future to take as many opportunities as you can to develop that. And also, you know, I think it's telling that this is probably the last function we develop before or as most of us are having kids, if that's something we choose to do, because you can have kids you can raise healthy kids without your vulnerable function being very good or developed. Like, it'll cause issues, but not insurmountable. But someone who is stunted in development and has not developed their inferior function is a really unbalanced, immature person. Like, it's, you're stuck in like a teenager mindset, and you don't really want most teenagers to be raising kids. They're still children themselves in some ways. So especially if that's something you're interested in, raising kids. But even if it's not, I think to be a healthy, mature adult, you have to accept and integrate your inferior function between the ages of 20 or 35 and so. And then after the age of, honestly, I'm not really sure about the age range explicitly, because I already feel like I've done a little bit of progression on this, and I'm not particularly mature or special in any way. So let's say from 25 plus, you start developing your vulnerable function. I think knowing typology helps. It's maybe something I wouldn't even have thought about if I didn't know typology, so maybe that influences it. It sounds like there's a dying dinosaur outside. It's like, ah! Okay, so I don't think that's necessarily something that I would have noticed on my own. But as far as integrating your vulnerable function, this I feel like I should explain. So that's the opposite function attitude of your tertiary function. So my tertiary is SE, so my third function is SE, so my vulnerable function is SI. I think the first step is just to stop denigrating people who show a lot of it. It's really easy to criticize people who it's kind of like a parallel, right? So if you're in high school, don't denigrate your inferior function because you'll need it later. Maybe that's the phase I'm in right now. Don't denigrate my vulnerable function, because then in the future, that's when I'll start needing it. So maybe I haven't actually started developing it completely yet. But so yeah, that's the first step, is just accept it as a useful and purpose, like there's a reason that it exists in the world, that it has value, even if you don't completely understand it yet. And then as you get older, yeah, that would be the function. So if you already feel like you're pretty comfortable with your inferior function and your ignoring function, don't ever stop developing them, then that would be kind of an issue. But you can focus more, especially in your middle age and older, on your vulnerable function. All right, so that's just a basic rundown of the stages of development. First ignoring, then inferior, then vulnerable. And the other ones kind of take care of themselves. You can do some work on your role function pretty much anytime. It's possible that slots in somewhere maybe between inferior and vulnerable. I honestly don't know, but your role function is stronger than your vulnerable, so it can handle a little more, and it's also more conscious. I'm not sure. From my experience, I think that that's something that you can kind of work on at any time. And I would recommend it. You're demonstrative, you don't have to worry about, again, don't consciously reject it and refuse to use it, but it'll kind of take care of itself. It's just as strong as your dominant function. And auxiliary, you don't have to worry about. Tertiary is also a lifelong process. Similar to your role, which makes sense. They're the same. They're both 2D. I'm not going to get into dimensionality well, actually, I'm going to cover it a little bit in a second, so hold your horses. But yeah, your tertiary, I also think that you can kind of do that whenever you are in the mood. It'd be good, and it'll be fun. Your tertiary function is fun to use, so if you need a break from some of the more difficult ones, hop onto your tertiary for a little while. All right, so let's talk about how to develop functions in general. And like I said, I have to bring dimensionality into this. So I haven't written an article on this yet, but I have written an article on strong versus weak functions and bold versus cautious functions. So dimensionality is actually just both of those dichotomies combined. So strong and bold, strong and cautious, weak and bold, weak and cautious. If you understand those, then you'll understand dimensionality when I get around to writing an article about it. But so I'm not going to go too deep into the theory here. You can go ahead and read those articles if you're interested. They're under the theory section on the Young Love site. But I will explain like the ramifications of that. So your dominant function and your demonstrative function are 4D functions, which means basically you don't even need to learn them. You can just use them at any time. You can use them for hypothetical situations. You know, I don't need to be in any particular situation in order to use FE. I can imagine something that could happen someday in the future and apply FE to that situation, know what I would do, know what the right and wrong choices are, how people will react, all those kind of things. Same thing with like, so Perfect Chazure and ENTJ, you can imagine a system of an organization or you know, a chain of events or something, and you can mentally fiddle with it and change it and already know what the outcome of it will be. That especially helps because you're an intuitive, but even like an ESTJ or whatever can manipulate TE in the hypothetical realm. So I mean, I guess if you want to develop it, you can like sit around and think about it, but that's going to happen anyway, so there's not really much use choosing to do that, consciously doing it, unless it's just for fun or whatever. So that's both your dominant and your demonstrative, which I feel like I shouldn't have to explain what each of them are. You guys can look it up if you need to, but demonstrative briefly is the opposite of your auxiliary. So auxiliary for me is NI, my demonstrative is NE. Alright, so that's 4D functions. 3D functions do not have the ability to work in the hypothetical realm. But they are very fluid in the moment. If you present a 3D function, so the 3D functions are your auxiliary and your ignoring. If you are in a situation, you can use it, like fluently, basically, accurately. Doesn't feel like much of a challenge. Might be tiring, especially with your ignoring function, but it's not mentally challenging or anything like that. So when you're integrating your ignoring function in high school, I would say that the best way to develop it would then be to put yourself in situations where you use it. That's basically it. You know, if you're an FE Dom, read a lot of literature, you know, and like think about how you feel about it. Or if you're a TE Dom, solve a lot of puzzles. You know, just do it. Also, giving advice is a really good way to use your ignoring function, and it'll be a lot less tiring than actively using it yourself. So I would suggest seeking out people who need help in that area and offering your advice, whether it's like on the internet or through friends, teaching. If you can do tutoring, that would be a really good way. If you're you know, an SE Dom, tutor history to someone, or like an SI subject, or teach someone, I know this is gonna sound like silly, but like teach someone how to do chores or something. Just like help someone else with that area of expertise. If you're an FI Dom, look for situations where you can mediate conflict. Maybe, you know, a lot of FI Doms do really well in those, I forget what they call them, but it's like teen counselor services at school. So if like someone's depressed, they can come talk to someone. That can also be FI, but like just getting that interpersonal interaction will help a lot for an FI Dom of that age. So those are your 3D functions, and like I said, you don't really need to worry that much about developing your auxiliary. You'll do it on your own. As far as your 2D functions, they really can't figure something out spontaneously, and they definitely can't do things in a hypothetical realm. So the primary way that 2D functions like to learn is through explicit instruction and education. Your 2D functions are your tertiary and your role functions. So these are the ones that I said that you can pretty much develop anytime you're in the mood to. I strongly recommend seeking out other people's expertise in these functions. Read books, go to classes, ask friends to help you, hang out with people who are strong in these functions. You know, if you're if you're an ISTJ and your tertiary function is I'm doing this. Okay, let's say you're an ISFJ and your tertiary function is TI. I keep using the same function examples. I need to think of something else. Anyway, hang out with a lot of TI people. Do TI things with them, and let them teach you about it. You know, that's the main thing. Don't try too hard to do it all on your own, because your tertiary function and especially your role function require a lot of external input in order to learn. So if you're just like sitting staring at something by yourself and you don't know how to do it, or you don't know what it means, like you're probably not going to come up with much until someone comes and explains it to you, shows you how to do it. So that would be my advice for that, is seek out help, seek out instruction. And finally, those are your 2D functions. So finally, your 1D functions. These are your inferior function and your vulnerable function. They can only learn through past experience. So someone, you know, I used an example before like this in a Reddit comment. If you have an INFP and you put a bunch of like pieces on the floor and you say build a table, like they just can't. Like they can like guess and make something that's like kind of resembles a table, but they don't know how. And even if you take them to like a table making class and like teach them the theory of table making and like, you know, these are the like different like angles that things need to be and like the considerations for weight, load bearing, and like all this, they can understand or they can learn all those rules, but until you like sit them down in front of the pieces and either give them explicit instructions or like tell them, okay, now do this, now do that, until they've done it with their own hands, they just can't use that information in any way, you know, as opposed to someone with higher TE who could go to that class and then figure out how to build a passable table, you know, based on that information that they learned, or even if they don't need to learn, maybe if you're Dom or Ox TE, you can just figure it out on your own. It's amazing. I have role TE, so I can't even imagine. But yeah, you know, so with your inferior function and your vulnerable function, the only way to get better at them is to use it. And even then, it's not, this is different from the auxiliary and the ignoring, because those ones you can figure it out because you were put in the situation. So if I have auxiliary or ignoring TE and I was put into a TE situation, so that would be a ITJ or ITP, so an IT. I was put in this table making situation. I have the shit on the floor. They can just be there and figure it out. They can figure out how to do it. Whereas the person with inferior or vulnerable just can't. Like they're just gonna stare at the pieces. The pieces aren't gonna do anything useful. It's really funny. I watch a lot of like reality shows like Amazing Race, and you put the poor like IFPs in these situations where they have to like put something together and they're just like, bless their hearts. So yeah, so it has to be not only you're in the situation, but also that there's a way to learn. So either they can learn through trial and error, like just like putting the pieces together until they can figure out something that looks good, and then in the future they'll remember what they learned and be able to apply it, or step-by-step instructions. And that's different from explicit instruction, and the instruction can explain principles or approaches, whereas your 1D functions, your inferior and vulnerable, don't need principles. Sorry, my video cut off. They don't need principles. They need like step-by-step, do this, do that, do this. And then over time, after having experienced it, then they will be able to do it in the future. And that's how you develop those functions. So my camera's like totally running out of battery, so I'm gonna stop it here, but I really hope that this was useful for you, and that yeah, I answered your questions. So in the future I'll talk more about each function and how you can develop those, like specifically FE, FI, and so on. So all right, bye.